Hey folks, let's see how this is working. I see there are two eyes here, so that's a good sign. Okay, let me get in the camera. Good morning. I'm trying something new today. I'm doing this through another app, which is allowing me to go to Facebook and YouTube both, but you know me and tech. It's a bit of a challenge, but I'm a crazy nut and I'm quilting on Christmas Eve morning, Sunday morning. Anyway, that's just the way it is. I just can't help myself when I get an idea and I really want to work with it and just have fun with it. And this is my own quilt. Some of you may remember seeing this in the late fall. I was Augustish. I was piecing it, and it's all Kaffe Fassette prints, as you can see, and it is crazy colorful and vivid and bold and absolutely fun. But I'm quilting parallel lines on it, and there's a couple points of interest that I thought you might want to see too. So, you know, if you're not watching this Christmas morning, I forgive you. You can always watch it later too. And by the way, our church, of course, does have Christmas Eve services. So we had one last night. I'm going to the same service again this morning, and then one at our daughter's later today as well at her church. So I'm getting my fill in of Christmas things too, but I do love quilting. Okay, so working on this quilt, a couple of the big things that came up are what thread to quilt with, and then I just have a couple of tips for you for quilting parallel lines that I think might be of help when you go to do your next straight line quilting. Thread choice was a big thing because look at all the colors. I mean, I've got the purples, the oranges, the vivid blues. You can see my backing is all kinds of shades of green. And the backing was kind of the deciding factor, honestly, for me. I think I made a little live video about my backing as well. But in short, I went first off to the store looking at some Kaffe fabrics like this pebbled one. There was a dark, very deep purple and navy one that I absolutely fell in love with. But this is a big quilt and it would have required buying just over 8 yards of fabric to do the backing. So instead I went to my stash and I picked all these bright chartreusey greens, and there are 7 different stripes across the width of the quilt. And so I just chose to piece the whole backing from my stash. Why not? I have it. So now that I've got all those shades of green in the backing, right away I thought, you know, green is probably a good choice of thread because it will match well on the backing and it's going to blend as well as anything else on the front of the quilt. So then the choice was just what shade of green to use. So I narrowed it down to these two. This one I call celery green. That's not its official name. And this one is wasabi, and it's this rich, slightly golden green. And this is what I finally came down on. It just, I did my little, you know, pull out some thread and puddle it on the quilt and moved it around on the different fabrics, looked at it on all of them. And the lightest fabric in it is the inside of these cups. So that was the critical one. And I thought it looked okay on there, and I loved it on everything else. It blends in really nicely, and it kind of, believe it or not, is subtle on this quilt. All things are relative, am I right? And by the way, unlike my usual lives, you won't be able to comment while we're on air today because I can't do all those things. So I'll have to come back and read comments later if you want to ask any questions. Okay, what I did decide to do, because as you can see my backing is quite a bit lighter, I did decide to put this lighter shade in the bobbin. So that's what's on the backing of it. So let's get on to our straight quilting tips because I think that's probably what you're here for. So I have a couple of them. One is, I'm making the assumption that you would be quilting with some type of channel lock, or in my case, I've got my belts engaged. So if you have a computerized machine, that's what you'll be doing too, is you'll be engaging your belts to hold yourself into straight horizontal lines. So that's the assumption to begin with. But one of the things that I do frequently throughout the quilt is I run my machine in a kind of dummy line, so I'm not actually stitching, but I might tuck my needle down or lower my presser foot, depending on what option you have, and run across the quilt near something that's straight. So in this case, it's a seam line. And check, I would have my hopper foot right at it, and I would check, is that straight all the way across? So that double check is good. It's good to use your channel lock when you base the top edge, so you know that is straight. And then as you're placing your whole quilt and getting ready to put your front anchoring on, double check as close to the front as you can that it's nice and straight there too. And if not, you know, do a little tugging to get it as straight as you can. And it's critical that you anchor all the areas. I usually do anyway. Put side clamps on, put front clamps on in some way. If you don't have front clamps, run a basting line along the front. It's critical that you get that front edge in place so it can't move while you quilt, because otherwise it will pull up in the middle, and even a 1/4 inch is going to show, is going to show like crazy. So it's critical that it does not do that for you. In addition, a couple other things. One that I didn't bring to show you, actually, I'm eyeballing the spacing of my lines. I've done this quite often, and that seems to work well for me relative to my hopper foot. But if I'm doing bigger spaced lines, or before I was comfortable doing this by eye, I used to put a piece of blue painter's tape on the bottom of my ruler wherever I wanted my spacing to be, so that I didn't have to read my ruler every time I was advancing. I just had that very vivid, very visible blue line to match to as I was measuring the spacing for my next line. So that blue painter's tape can be a help. You got to think of it, you're doing a couple of 100 lines down this quilt, so you want to make them each a little bit more efficient, right? And then another tip is, when you do advance the quilt, often when I'm doing edge to edge work, I'll just leave my needle down and pull the machine forward. But number one, I've got my belts engaged so it does not pull easily. But even if I were to disengage those belts to advance, I like to pull my needle out of the fabric when I'm doing straight lines, because when you pull the machine along with it, it inevitably does stretch just a little bit. And, again, for edge to edge work that's swirly or busy, that doesn't seem to matter at all. You can zhuzh it a little bit and it's fine. But for these quite precise spacing of lines, it does matter. So get the needle up, break thread, so that when you advance the quilt, it's as smooth and even as it possibly can be. And at that point, you just go back to the smoothing, the using seam lines, measuring with your gauge when your channel lock is on, going back and forth and looking at it a little bit, all those things again to double check that you've got all this quilting area as straight and square as you possibly can. My last tip is for when you're actually sewing. This happens at a domestic machine, and it happens at a long arm as well. When you're going back and forth in alternating directions, sometimes your fabric will push in front of you just a little bit and then do the other direction on the way back, and you'll get these push-pull lines. And it can be very, very subtle, but it's really, really easy to avoid that. And the way to do it is, say I'm stitching this way away from you. This has been stitched. I just rest my hand with a couple ounces of pressure on the area that's been stitched, and it pulls the area I'm going to stitch under the needle just a tiny touch faster, and it eliminates that just as easy peasy. And so when I'm stitching back the other way, then I'll put my hand on the other side. And can you see that? It just pulls that up just a touch. And that's all it takes to keep really flat, really even stitching. And you can see all this area is done. I'll move Stella out of the way, and you can kind of get a glimpse. I love it. It is just bringing this quilt to life. So, so fun. So there you go. Some straight line quilting tips. Hope you enjoyed them, and I'm going to get back to quilting on this Christmas Eve morning. Merry Christmas to you and whoever you're with this week. I just hope that you have a wonderful, enriching, soul-fulfilling Christmas. See you next time.